My name is Helen Molesworth, and I'm your host today for Program Fall 2021, a live streaming all-day event where we've been talking to some of our time and our culture's most interesting minds about the thing that matters the most to me, which is art. We do this courtesy of the David Zwirner Gallery, and right now we find ourselves live in New York City. And I am seated with Cathy Park Hong. I'm really been looking forward to this conversation. She is the author of Minor Feelings, an Asian American Reckoning. It's been a national bestseller. It's a book that so many people are reading. My favorite podcast with Jenna Wortham. I'm blanking on the name of that.
Still processing.
Still processing.
Yeah.
That's and Wesley Morris. They did a whole episode on your book.
Totally fangirling.
I was fangirling on your behalf because I thought, wow, that must feel amazing to have two people as smart as them talk about your book for a whole session. And we have this extraordinary Ruth Asawa show up here at the gallery, organized by yours truly. What's extraordinary about it is not that I organized it, but that the work itself is so remarkable. And I thought, who better to talk to about Ruth Asawa than Cathy Park Hong? Because one of the things that we're trying to do with this program series is to connect people who I like to say are like sort of art world adjacent. So poets, writers, filmmakers, musicians, fashion designers, folks who come from other creative fields, and to get them into dialogue about the art that matters most to us. So I wanted to invite you here to talk about Ruth Asawa, and I'm so glad that you're here. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. I'm happy to talk about Ruth Asawa, whose work I love, and it's an honor to talk to you too.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
So maybe we could just start by, I know that I know I saw you at the opening. I know you just got a tour of the show. And I guess I would just like to ask you, like, what did you know about her before? What do you think you know about her now? How are you thinking about her as an artist in your pantheon of artists at the moment?
Actually, previous to this invitation, I didn't know much about Ruth Asawa. I've seen some of her sculptures, like maybe in catalogs or in a group show, or she was always sort of in the peripheries of my knowledge of artists, which isn't great. I mean, I have my favorites, but it's definitely not comprehensive. So but I was very curious about her work, and so when you asked me to look at her show and come talk to you, I was really excited because it was like gave me a chance to do a deep dive into her work. And so I saw the show this Tuesday. And like the dates are just I have no sense of time now. But and I went, and her work is transcendent. It's beautiful. It's just sublime, and her wire suspended sculptures, and I also really adored her drawings, which are I don't know, just everything that she, her hand, I just want to say her hands, like just sense of touch is just sublime. And so just like aesthetically, I just loved looking at her work, and it was just, and also the fact that they weren't, like even her sculptures or her drawings were not perfectly symmetrical, but they were all kind of asymmetrical, and that's what made them very singular and original. But then when I read her book, it was just really a treat. When I read, kind of took a dive into her books, like, and I knew that she was sent to the Japanese internment camp, but to really kind of understand her life in conjunction to her work was really enriching. And I think, like, after I read her books, what really struck me about her sculptures and her life was the sheer amount of labor involved, and how, I know she was influenced by the Black Mountain College, Joseph Albers, and so forth. So she was, of course, trained to be very process-oriented. But just just how there's just so much domestic labor, agricultural labor, artistic labor, but also I was just thinking about the invisible labor that Asian Americans, provided for this country, with her family. I was just reading about how she was, one of 6 children, and lived in the farm. And when she wasn't going to school, she was planting and harvesting. And so she was like, from a very young age, she was always working the earth, And then I was also thinking of that, like, when I was reading her biography and how she was sent to the Japanese internment camp, and one of her first classes was with Japanese also people who were interned who were Disney animators. And I was like just utterly fascinated by that too. And here's like more invisible labor, these Japanese American animators who make these like films that are iconic of America, that like show the sort of idealized iconic America. And then also the fact that, like, while she was raising her 6 children, she was making these beautiful objects, just constantly, all the in-between times that when she wasn't raising her children or, doing. And then afterwards, when she was a public advocate, I mean, it was just, her work is genius, but I'm just also just really fascinated by that aspect. Like, yes, her work looks so sublime, but the kind of tenacity that was involved to make those pieces was really really interesting to read.
It's interesting to me to listen to you talk about this kind of invisible or below the line sort of labor of Asian Americans in this country. I think I know exactly what you mean there. And Asawa's work, it seems to me, is always letting you see how much labor there has been. Like there's something about it, all those drawings and all, when she makes like the drawings of Paul, which is, one of her sons in the bed, and the entire frame is filled with those incredible hatch marks, and one of the things that's so incredible about that drawing is there's the tenderness of this sleeping baby, a moment when perhaps a mother gets to rest.
Yeah.
And then the entire page covered with marks, as if she's letting you know there's actually no resting. There's only ever labor.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it just seems like she's showing you her hand.
Yeah.
Right? Like both as a poker metaphor and as an art metaphor and as a labor metaphor constantly.
Yeah.
In some way that's never didactic, but omnipresent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it just feels, I mean, I'm also interested, like when I was doing the tour, someone was telling me, Greg, I believe, was telling me that she was only got like 4 or 5 hours of sleep a night.
Yes.
And I'm like, she's one of those magical people who could go, oh, maybe it's because she had to, but she just needed to. And so when all of her children were asleep, that was when she was making those drawings of her children asleep. And they're just beautiful, exquisite drawings. But yeah, they're like the kind of repetitive marks. And there are a lot of, actually, I was thinking about the repetition and how obsessive her work was. Like, when she was like doing the wire weavings, and she was kind of crocheting the ease, and it was just so much. I was curious. I just started thinking about other female artists who do these like repetitive, obsessive, process-oriented work from cast-off materials and so forth. And I think it's also kind of different than like what, like, there are also male artists who have done that too, not to be reductive about gender or anything, but like for them, like when I think of Warhol, for instance, and there's like, his work is very much, seems to be, that kind of repetition seems very much about the assembly, the factory. It's machinic. It's more about sort of this kind of capitalist reproduction of objects, whereas for her, it just seems like that kind of repetition seems much more, I don't really know how to say it, but it just seems much more generative, holistic,
Right.
just like, but also something else. Maybe it's meditative. It was like, oh, she was such a workaholic. And I was just also wondering, it was like, it was almost like she was someone who was just completely alienated, right, as a Japanese American woman. And she was, and she was also so forgiving. That's like, I would not be forgiving if I were her, but she was so forgiving. She was like, I wouldn't have been an artist if I didn't go to the Japanese internment camp. That was where I actually had time to take art classes and make art. And after she got out of the Japanese internment camp, she said, I'm not, she went to Milwaukee teaching school, and she said, and then she couldn't get a job, right? Because of systemic discrimination, and like Japanese Americans couldn't get jobs anywhere.
Right. And specifically as teachers.
It's specifically as teachers, except pretty much manual labor. So she was like, I'm going to go to Black Mountain College. And she was saying that those obstructions allowed her to be an artist. So she was glad that happened. And I was like, wow, that's just really...
It's remarkable.
Yeah.
I know.
Remarkable that...
I know she is someone who suffered such extraordinary hardship. I mean, one can't really imagine internment. And yet, her family, I mean, I've spoken with her children a great deal about this. They are very clear that, what she said to them was racism is an excuse to have hatred. And she just wasn't going to get into it at all. Like, she wasn't going to have hate in her heart. She wasn't going to accept anybody else's hatred of her. And she says this kind of incredible thing at Black Mountain. And I think she says it partly, I hear Buckminster Fuller in her ear, someone who was teaching at Black Mountain when she was there, with whom she had a very intense relationship. He designed her wedding ring, for instance. So, I mean, we're talking about a woman whose wedding ring was designed by Buckminster Fuller, a special person. And she says at Black Mountain that she proclaims at some point that she is a citizen of the universe. Like, not even the world, but like the universe. And that's the field that she's putting herself in. And another thing that one of her daughters told me this past trip was that she considered herself to be a minority of one.
Yeah.
And I wonder, as in the wake of this book that you've written about this very odd phrase we have, Asian American, that encompasses, I mean, you actually, I wrote it down. You have a great opening sentence. You say, who is us, right? Like so many different narratives, so many different stories. I just wonder how the citizen of the universe and a minority of one, how do they strike you as self identifications?
That's a very good question. I think if like Ruth Tasawa would have likely rejected the term Asian American, but it was a very different time. But I don't know, actually, maybe she was, I mean, she also had lived in the Bay Area, and she was also very much involved with advocacy work through her art. So I shouldn't say that. But yeah, the kind of being the cosmic citizen. And I mean, I wonder if she was, I also was reading another passage where she was telling her husband that, warning her husband, who's white, that, please, I don't exactly remember what she said, but that she was like, it's going to be really hard,
Right,
being in an interracial marriage, and that she was discriminated against, and that, he was going to be exposed to that. And so it's like, in every way, she was stopped from doing what she wanted to because she was Japanese American, and because she was a woman. She was a Japanese American woman. And so it was almost like she was using her artwork, her labor. She was using work to kind of push through that, push through all of the kind of, her containment, you know, and just be like, this is like, it's like a way to kind of transcend whatever containment that she felt as a Japanese American woman. And it's also very interesting that she used the term minority of one. She didn't say, I am one, but she said a minority of one.
Right.
And so it's like, you know, clearly she wanted to be recognized for herself, like everyone does. You know, you want to be recognized. And this was my struggle too when I was early on, you know, a struggling poet. I also just was really frustrated by kind of these racial labels because I just wanted to be recognized for my own talents. And it was this kind of determination that if I worked hard enough and showed them, proved to them that I could write good poems, then it wouldn't matter. And I think, you know, probably a lot of artists of color would feel that way. And she did that too. But I think for her, I guess it was also more the citizen, you know, something universe.
The citizen of the universe.
Citizen of the universe. It's even more, I don't know, it's spiritual, I guess.
It is. I mean, to me, I mean, we can talk about containment with Asawa, and I also feel like the citizen of the universe moment is like almost complete dispersal. I mean, I imagine like this atomization of the body into stars. And then when I think about Asawa and containment and labor, of course, those sculptures are containers that are transparent, containers that both hold and don't hold things, containers that shape the space, but also are all activate the space around them. I mean, in the room that we have now at the gallery where they're hanging, you know, I don't know what sometimes is more enlivening, like this sort of frontal view, or when you walk around and you're so aware of the corners and the curves and, you know, all of the negative space in between the sculptures themselves. So she's someone who experiences hardship and somehow metabolizes it not as trauma. And I don't understand how she did that. I really don't.
Yeah.
But I'd like to, because it seems like there's some kernel of something in there that would be really useful to know how to propagate, you know?
Resilience, you know, just obsessive focus, love. I don't know. I mean, family and community. I mean, it's, you know, with like, you know, as much as there was it seemed like, I mean, she was a Buddhist, right? Or
I'm not sure exactly. I think the kids were raised with Buddhism, but I think they were kind of like taught it surreptitiously, if you know what I mean, like almost more by example. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, it's like, it seems like her work is also, now I don't want to say this because I think like a lot of people are going to say, oh, it's because she's an Asian American woman or something, but there is also some, you know, it's like, it was almost like she was subsuming, there's no sense of like she was subsuming the self into the objects that she was making, into the baskets, into the dreams and so forth. So I don't know. Yeah.
It's interesting. I mean, I know we have this dilemma now, it seems to me, in the 21st century where, and it kind of, I want to get back to something you said about Warhol and repetition and gender, because I think there is this quality, obviously, of obsessive compulsive repetition in Asawa, and we see that in many artists throughout the 20th century. And we want to look at Asawa as Asawa, but to look at her as Asawa means to address the fact that she is Japanese American, that she did grow up on a farm, that she is from the West and not the East, that she is a woman, that she's a mother of 6 children. And so I guess I'm curious how you are navigating, on the one hand, as you even said about your own work, this desire to have the work be registered for its own sake, and still the value we place on that. And a new set of values that are asking us to really attend to the specificity of people's lives and the specificity of how they're positioned in a culture. And none of this sits easily. I mean, I think so much of your book is actually kind of about like, how do we put the pieces of this story together?
Well, I mean, you addressed this actually in the essay that you wrote, the brilliant essay you wrote about Asawa. But, you know, I think it's a disservice to her work just to treat them as formalist objects, right? But I also understand why there was this need to kind of historicize or canonize her work as formalist modern objects, you know, modern artworks, because before, when she was alive, they were just you know, the critics were very condescending, and they thought that her baskets were, you know, very Oriental. You know, it was a lot of Orientalist kind of criticism or praise, you know, of her work, that it was very well crafted, and then you know, it was yeah, there were pieces of craft,
right?
And so it was almost like a need to kind of foreground the fact that they were you know, singular modern artworks, and also to not emphasize her biography, right? Because that means that would also kind of degrade her, you know, artwork as fine art, you know. And I think that, you know, in my book, I kind of raise the question of why we need to constantly treat you know, the biography of the artist or the identity of the artist and the artwork itself as binaries, or either you have to show one, it's either one or the other. I think, you know, part of that is, you know, in the past, and it still happens now, this happens a lot in writing, that when a writer of color or an artist of color produces work, people are more interested in fetishizing the artist's life, you know, whatever racial trauma, whatever gender or, you know, gender trauma that they went through, they prioritize that, and then whatever kind of genius that whatever makes the work genius is, you know, not appreciated. So it's like, it's this constant struggle of one or the other. And I'm like, especially with someone like Ruth Asawa, especially someone like her, where like later on in her work, she was doing a lot of artist advocacy work. I think it's possible we have to find a new way to talk about artists, it's artists of, not just artists of color, but white artists too, white male artists, you know, bring in their biography, bring in like why they were able to show as early as they did or as late as they did. And, you know, it's, you know, the focus should be on the conjunction, and it should be their biography and their artwork. How did the historical period of that time, or the economic period of that time, inform that artwork and so forth? You know, we don't need to fetishize the trauma of that artist's life, you know, in order to bring more value into the artwork, you know. And I think there's just more generative ways where we kind of, you know, unravel those polarities that we are so stuck on.
I'm totally with you. I'm all about, like, let's talk about, I mean, as opposed to sort of rushing headlong into the universal where we strip away all these markers of identity. Like, let's get really specific about the white boys. Let's like really talk about where they came from too.
Let's talk about the white boys and like, exactly. Let's talk about whiteness, you know?
Right.
It's not just about artists of color. I'm like,
right.
Okay, like we really need to get down and, okay, like why did, I don't know, anyone selective.
It makes me want to come back to you about, so I've got this thing about Warhol and Asawa. So, and you brought Warhol up, so I want to just run this like pet theory I have up the flagpole and see if it resonates, because I think it might. You said something in your book I might hook into. So Warhol very famously at the factory took Polaroids of everyone who came in, the film camera was set up for the screen test. There was this sort of constant documenting of the people who were there. We read that in terms of Hollywood and spectacle culture and star culture and the banal and, you know, the ubiquitousness of the photographic image and the society of the spectacle. We put a lot of big theoretical trappings around that. Here we have Ruth Asawa, whose birth and life dates are, you know, uncannily close to Warhol. I mean, they're basically the same generation. And she too she's making face casts of everybody who comes to visit the house. Her friends, her family, the kids' friends, the kids who are in the art program that she started in the San Francisco Public School. And so here you have on different coasts, totally different subjectivities, and yet they're both producing indexical records, you know, one-to-one matrix. I mean, what's more indexical than the Polaroid and a clay face mask of the face. And I'm craving, I want to see them together. I want to see how different they are. I want to see how similar they are. And I want to figure out a way to talk about what is holding these two otherwise seemingly radically different subjectivities together in this work that they're doing on faces. And I know you have a little thing about the face in your book and Levinas, and I don't know, I wonder if we could just, like, does that open anything for you?
Faces, the way Warhol approached faces.
And versus the way Asawa is
faces. Approach face,
because I feel this essential gendering coming in my argument, because then you were going to get Asawa the tender, Asawa the loving, Warhol the cold and distant. Do we have to gender that, or can we talk about that in ways that are?
Well, I mean, what do we? I mean, I think we tend to turn a cynical eye on Warhol, right? But like both of them were also very much. I mean, if we're talking about process, I mean, it was all. They were just constantly engaged with the people around them, you know? And so Warhol had the factory, right? And he had all of his friends, his celebrity friends coming through. He had like this, you know, he had, you know, an army of assistants, I'm sure, who was helping him making his silk screens. But so did Ruth Asawa, right? I mean, she had her children.
Well, she had her children.
She had her children. You know,
she actually only has. She sort of famously only has really one assistant who helps her. But she's always giving those kids something to do. That's for sure.
Yeah, she put her children to work. But it was quite different. But there was that same kind of social engagement, I guess, in the process of making work. But you know, you could. I don't know if I would gender it, but there's, you know, what I can say about the faces in Warhol's paintings or his prints is that they're, you know, they're flat. You don't see the touch. You don't see the hand. You don't see any of that. And it's like, but it's supposed to be like that, you know, because they're reproductions, whereas all of Ruth Asawa's work are not,
it's all touch.
It's all touch. It's all touch, and it's all, you know, recognizable faces. Like there's Buckminster Fuller's with his big forehead, and then there's like the you know, her children's foreheads, and I mean faces. You know, it seemed like she was really interested in the details of the face. You know? I mean, all of her work is so much about the detail, and also what is in the repetition. The variation and the repetition, what makes the person, you know, all that what makes a person unique. And, you know, I don't want to subscribe to like sort of these gender stereotypes by saying that her masks were tender and so forth. But it's also fascinating to think about. No, I'm not. I don't want to go there. But anyway, yeah. It would be an interesting show to have both of them.
Yeah, and I wonder if we could just pop back a little minute to like what would happen if we foregrounded the biographies of the white men in the same way and we talked about whiteness in that way. I wonder if, I don't know, do you think if we did that, whiteness might start to come undone? Like, does whiteness stand because we preserve it by never interfering with it with specificity?
Yeah.
Right? And like, and what we're doing always when we're talking about work made by women or work made by Asian Americans or a Black, gay, like when we put this, then we're immediately trying to squirm. We both want the label to claim it, to identify it, and then we're also squirming under its pressure.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think if we did that with whiteness, that whiteness would have to squirm too?
Oh, there's a lot of
work.
I'm sure there would be a lot of squirming. I mean, I mean, I think that's starting to happen in writing. I don't know if it's happening in the art world. Like I was part of the Racial Imaginary curatorial group that helmed by Claudia Rankin, where we actually did a show about whiteness, and this is going in another direction, but it was based on this essay, also based on Sarah Ahmed's essay, Phenomenology of Whiteness. And, you know, in her essay, she was like, even the way you move in a space, you know, even if you move, the way you move in a space is just so encoded in whether you're white or not, or entering into a white gallery space full of white people. You know, you're going to move your body in a different way than if you're someone of color and everything. It needs to be acknowledged. So if there was an artist who from a very young age, who was a wunderkind, you know, and who was like, was a star. I'm trying to think of that one abstract artist, and I can't. My mind is escaping me. And then he had a very good, strong career on the route. You know, let's look at that ease.
Right.
Why was it so easy for him to kind of have that kind of career, as it was so difficult for someone like Ruth Asawa,
right,
to be constantly obstructed from making her artwork? But you know, she was able to make lemonade out of lemons or whatever. You know,
right.
That was her whole life, I guess.
Right. I mean, it feels like obstruction from the outside. And it you know, I mean, there's part of me that's like pissed, right, that I didn't get Ruth Asawa in college. She could have been inflecting my thought all these past 25 years. It would have been great to have had 25 years of my professional life in which Ruth Asawa was a major figure, pushing the levers of what that would have meant. And on the other hand, to come to her now, so full, you know, like the full career on view, it just seems like such a lesson in how to be, you know, that in the face of obstruction. It's like, you know, I almost feel like she's like that. I forget what Kafka story it is, where the guy keeps going to the wall and there's a door and there's a guard and he says, you know, can I go in? And the guard says no, and the guard says no, and the guard says no. And then the guy watches another guy like just walk around, like the wall has stopped and he walks around the wall.
Yeah.
So it's like this parable about like, don't ask for permission, just go around the wall.
Yeah.
And she seems to have done that
to go around.
Yeah, she just went around the wall.
I mean, it's like what I tell my students, like, you know, when I make them write a form, you know, a sonnet or something, which has a bunch of rules. I'm like, well, if there's a constraint that makes you think more creatively or more imaginatively, you like, if there is like a block, you know, blockade and on the road, then you find creative ways to go around it, which is what Ruth Asawa did. I mean, she was determined to be an artist. So she used cast off materials. She used whatever was at hand, wire, dirt, whatever. And then and then when she was in the internment camp, but I think even if she wasn't at the internment camp, even if she didn't, you know, she would still have found a way to be an artist because she was that determined. I don't think it was because she went to an internment camp she became an artist. And I think there's also a way to kind of narrativize her life where, you know, you could say that you know, it's like the typical sort of Hollywood arc that she was able to, you know, she overcame all obstacles. And then now she's the artist who's shown in all of these museums and so forth. She survived it, and she only grew stronger with each obstacle, like with each kind of racial trauma or that she encountered. And I would definitely, you know,
it would have been nice if she had gotten some of her flowers while she was alive. That would have been really nice. I agree.
But this is a case we were talking about before that, you know, with a lot of these female artists that it's always infuriatingly posthumous. I think that
I don't know what it is about this field that I am participating in that I love so much that we do like our women artists very old and dead.
Yeah.
That's how
we like them.
That's how we like them, and I find it deeply disturbing. But I want to ask you another question about, so one of the things that's happening in the art world right now is that there's definitely, we have this thing, as you do in literature, called the canon. And I guess I have a sort of big question about the canon and canonicity. For you, is the game to enter people who were left out of a white male European, Anglo-American European canon? Is it to enter the folks who were left out of it into it? Is it to create many canons, an Asian American canon that would include people, like Bernice Bing or Kei Sakamachi, Noguchi, Leo Amino? Do we want to do that? Is Ruth Osawa the grandmother of the Asian American canon? If we insert her into the Western canon, when do we put her there? Do we act like, should we put her in a room with those other 50s artists and act like people knew that she was part of that conversation? Or should we only start showing her like in the 2000s when she really started to emerge as a figure that we talked about? Like, I guess I'm curious. I mean, do you encounter the same problem with Asian American literature? How are you feeling about this academic project of the canon?
I mean, I guess like right now we are really kind of interrogating American letters and American art and who we've excluded and who we must not include. I don't like the word inclusion, it just seems like it sounds as if the kind of framework of canonicity is still intact, but we're just allowing a few more artists of color or writers of color in there.
And I think I know what you mean, but I want to say it to make sure. Do not like it because it still preserves a power relationship, like that I as a white, we can get specific. I as a white person let you in as a non-white person. Right? That's the logic in that field.
Or it's not even you as a person.
Right. No, I understand
like
that. But
the museum or the space or the gallery space and so forth. And it's like, I feel more comfortable talking about this with literature because I don't really have a real pulse on what's happening in the art world. But with literature, it's like there is this real kind of reckoning that's happening, right? It's happening everywhere culturally, and and the conservatives are freaking out about it too, where they're understanding that the canon has been predominantly white and that it has to, first of all, include more people of color, but also we need to go back and find those unheard voices and kind of include them or incorporate them or put them on the platform so that they're visible and heard and read and studied, and I think all of that is very important work. I think now I'm going to talk more about literature. This author Viet Thanh Nguyen says that it's not just about more stories being told or more of our stories being told. It's also just sort of decolonizing the whole structure, the whole mode of production, as well. It's also kind of changing the mode of production as well as publishing those stories, So it's like people of color or people from, working class backgrounds or people from the marginalized backgrounds have to take control and find different means, and with the art world, I don't know. I mean, I think it's so much more tied to the market, so it works differently than literature. I think it's really great, first of all, that Ruth Osawa is now being shown in museums, and that she's having these she's David Zwirner is representing her estate, and she should be put in whatever context works. And this is where it's like there in a multiplicity. Her work should be, should sort of redefine what art in the 50s was, right? Or it could redefine what feminist art was, or you could also kind of shape her work. She could be one of the kind of grandmothers of Asian American art. That could all be great. I just wonder, though, the canon is still the canon, and obviously we're still going to exclude other artists. And what's there to say? Like, there's an interest in Black artists now. There's an interest in Asian American artists now. The fact is, the art world is still tied to the market, which is so obvious, such an obvious thing to say. Like, well, what's going to happen next year or 2 years or 3 years from now, when race is no longer such a hot topic.
Right.
This is why it's so important that people of color are also in control of the mode of production, which I can easily talk in the writing world. It's, perhaps I could sort of define it more clearly. In the art world, it just seems so, I don't know, labyrinthine,
Right.
Yeah.
I do think what you're saying is really interesting, though, because I think that one of the things Ruth Asawa's whole oeuvre shows us is actually she's offering a different model of production.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, she's offering a studio that's contiguous with the home. She's offering a model of production that's deeply imbricated in the maternal. There are these 6 kids. She doesn't get to go off and be by herself all day and make her art and then come back and there's some meal cooked for her. She's working in all these interstitial moments. She's working without the steady response of an audience, without the steady demand of a market. She's working without a certain kind of approbation. She's clearly making that stuff because she really wants to. Like, it's really internal to her. And I find that one of the most exciting things actually about the work sometimes.
Yeah.
It's like that, as much as I wish I had known about it earlier, I'm also really amazed at what it looks like when someone is left alone and does their work out, without having to process all of the attention and demands and pressures and interpretations. Like, one of the things we're looking at is what it's like to have an idea and to play it out over 60 years in all those different forms for oneself.
I know. No, she really is offers an alternative model than, and of course I guess you could attach fancy words to it now. It's like, she was the early predecessor of social practice or relational aesthetics or or the aesthetics of care, blah, blah, blah. But she was just doing it. She was just she didn't care. She was like, she wanted, what was most important to her was to have the time to make her work. And she did, with her children around her. And afterwards, when she was in San Francisco, later on in her life, when she was doing, she helped with or planned all these initiatives with public schools.
I mean, she basically invented the art program in the San Francisco public school systems.
That's incredible.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah.
It's really extraordinary.
Yeah.
I know. All right. I think we should turn to some audience questions. Let me get them up here. Okay. All right. Always so glad to hear Kathy talk. I'd be curious to hear from her, that's you, about the role of reckoning in Asawa's work. and here it comes with some flowers. Your book is always at hand in my house, so heavily annotated, and has been an important lens for my studies in Asian American history and art history. So, what do you? Is there a reckoning for you? Does the word you use in the subtitle of your book?
A reckoning for who? Is it like a reckoning for the audience about, or the reckoning of the art world about her work, or is it like a reckoning for me personally? Or
I don't know. I guess you could take it. I mean, that's the thing about reckoning.
yeah,
Kind of takes two to tango on a reckoning, doesn't it?
yeah. It's we're oh, how would I answer it? I think that if can you add one more? Can you just ask that?
I'd be curious to hear from her about the role of reckoning, in quotes, in Asawa's work. Is there a reckoning in the work, do you think?
I don't know if I would use the word reckoning.
I don't would either.
Because her work is so, I don't know. I think of reckoning as this kind of, not a revelation necessarily, but as this kind of, well, maybe it is a kind of recognition or a change of mind. But I think for her, her work just seems so continuous and seamless. I think there is perhaps a reckoning for the viewer or the art world when they come upon Ruth Asawa's work and realize that,
Yeah.
he was this genius artist. Maybe I shouldn't use the word genius, but she was a genius artist who we have ignored for so many years. And let's talk about that. I think that's more the reckoning. I wonder about,
That's right.
I don't know about Ruth Asawa's work being a reckoning.
Well, I think it goes back to this uncanny way she had of not letting these obstacles obstruct her, right?
Yeah.
But I do sense, and I certainly sensed that on Tuesday night at the opening, that the audience was having a reckoning.
Well, I just want to say very quickly, I was thinking of the civil rights activist, race activist, Yuri Kuchiyama, who's around the same age as Ruth Asawa, who was also sent to the Japanese internment camp, also in Arkansas, but she was sent to the Jerome internment camp. And then afterwards, she moved to New York with her husband. She also had 5 or 6 children. And she was became a huge organizer, anti-racist organizer, and a close friend to Malcolm X. And for her, she had reckoning in her life. She was when she was working at a restaurant full of Black employees, they told her about this civil rights, about the history of slavery and segregation and everything, and that what she went through with the internment camp was part of white supremacy.
Right.
And that was a reckoning for her. I don't know if Ruth Asawa had that same relationship.
I don't think that she did.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really interesting that she didn't. Mm-hmm. There's one, I think we have time for one more question. It says, it is not so much, well, this is a hard question that's unanswerable, but I'm going to ask it because it's unanswerable. Asawa did everything the art world says not to do. She was a housewife. She had 6 kids. She had a studio in the home. She exhibited in the home. She used craft materials. Just wondering what the art world can do today to discover the Asawas of tomorrow instead of discovering them and celebrating them long after their life. Yes. Yeah. Well, I can just say that something has haunted me my whole career as a curator, and it was something that Lucy Lepard writes about in a memoir, I think. And she says for the first 10 years of her life, she would go and do studio visits with men, because that's who the artists were in the 60s. And there was always a woman making artwork in the kitchen, and she never asked to talk to them. And I have always made it a habit to talk to the spouse of whoever I'm doing a studio visit with, in the hopes that the Asawas of today don't need to wait so long to find their place in our world. I want to thank you, Kathy, so much for being with us this afternoon and helping to just continue to push at these terms. I really loved your answer to the canon question. that maybe one way to be like Ruth Asawa in relationship to the canon is to stop imagining it as an obstacle and just keep proliferating all of the energy around it. So show her this way, show her that way, talk about her this way, talk about her that way, and sort of eat away at the hegemony of that idea, but not head on, always kind of always against the grain. I really appreciated that answer greatly.